Decades changed the names of enemies into names of colleagues. He shook hands with former Luftwaffe pilots who were grandfathers now, their hands spotted like maps. They compared notes in a shorthand only those who had flown could fully understand. Altitudes, angles, bursts that went long, a cloud that opened at the right time. One of them mentioned Egon Meyer and paused as if asking permission. Johnson nodded. They spoke of the man with the care one reserves for a worthy opponent and a lost era. When they parted, they hugged like men do who know how lucky they were to grow old enough to hug anyone at all. The last time he visited a Thunderbolt running on a test stand, he stepped back instinctively when the engine caught. The same shove in the chest, the same sneer of power. He laid a hand on the cowling when the magnetos were off and the heat soaked his palm. "You're still here," he told the machine. "So am I." A mechanic nearby smiled without intruding. Veterans spoke to airplanes sometimes. It was not superstition, just acknowledgement. What stayed with him most was not the tally of victories, though history would keep them in indexable rows, but how the airplane made an ordinary man capable of extraordinary endurance. The jug did not flatter, it demanded. It asked a pilot to be strong enough to move it, patient enough to wait for it, wise enough to let it do the thing it did better than anything else. Bring him home when everything reasonable said he should not get there. That was the center of the story he told children and dignitaries, and anyone who asked why he survived June 26, 1943. He said the pilot mattered, and the airplane mattered, and luck mattered, and that on that day all three were excessive in his favor. He lived long enough to see historians argue over details that had once been just the way a man remembered breathing. Was it 40 German fighters or closer to 20? Did Egon Meyer fire the last burst or another ace? Did a jammed canopy save him by trapping him in a machine that refused to quit? He listened to the debates the way one listens to weather reports from places one no longer lives. Useful for others, but not binding. In his own ledger, the numbers mattered less than the shape of the moment. Surrounded, wounded, unarmed, and somehow still airborne because steel and will made a brief alliance. On rare nights he would take the notebook from his desk and run a thumb along the edge until a certain page found him. The page had oil on it from hands long washed, a smear that looked like a map of a coast he knew without coordinates. The line he reread was short, "You can't kill a jug." He closed the book and smiled at the arrogance of youth and the truth that the sentence still held. When his time came, it came without drama. Friends and family gathered and told stories that embarrassed and pleased him in equal measure. A phone call arrived from a museum asking for the loan of a photograph, and he said yes, of course, and then asked them to be sure to list the crew chief's name in the caption. At the service, a slow fly-past of a restored P-47 carved a contrail into an afternoon cloud and peeled away with a roll that everyone pretended not to resent as too joyful for mourning. He would have approved. He had always thought funerals should include at least one reminder that life is loud and fast and brighter than we remember when we are tired. Years after, a kid who had grown up watching documentaries on a glowing screen stood under the wing of a museum Thunderbolt and read his name on a placard. The kid looked up and tried to imagine the weight of those 8 guns, the way the barrels must have buzzed like hornets when they spoke. He ran a hand over a rivet line and felt something like a frequency hum through his palm that wasn't really there. And in that moment, Without the words to say it, he understood why a story about a single airplane and a single pilot refusing to die could belong to people who were not yet born when the sky cracked with gunfire. He understood that endurance can be inherited by listening hard enough. He promised himself he would remember that when his own life asked him to keep flying through smoke. The day dimmed. Museum lights clicked on. The airplane did what old airplanes do when people stop touching them. It kept a silence that was not empty but full of the minutes it had once lived loudly. Somewhere inside that silence, if you tuned yourself to it, you could still hear the cadence of 8 Brownings, the frank music of a radial engine finding its rhythm again after a cough, and a young man's breath catching once as he realized he would see home one more time. Boring was a gift the air could not give for long. The hedgerow country inland made the ground war vicious. The Thunderbolts became ploughs of a terrible sort, opening lanes through traffic and strong points. Johnson talked controllers onto targets by radio using codes everyone knew were poor disguises. Sometimes he saw white flags and pulled away. Sometimes he did not. He learned the sound anti-aircraft guns made when they were close, the flat, sudden slap that meant the next one would be closer if he did not jink now. By late summer, he had a rhythm for ground attack that bordered on musical. Dive, fire, feel the recoil, add a new note to engine song, pull, roll, count, reverse, dive again. He husbanded ammunition, not from fear but from craft. 8 guns could make a man greedy. A craftsman knew when less was enough. He told a new pilot after landing, "If you hear your guns run out while you're still over the target, you wrote the wrong sentence." The war's end began to cast its shadow in autumn. The Luftwaffe could still surprise, could still kill, but its surprises came fewer, its kills dearer. The 56th measured its days in tonnage destroyed on rails and roads and in pilots rotated home looking 10 years older than their papers said. Johnson knew his number would come up soon for stateside. He found that he did not want it as much as he had expected. Rhythm had become identity. He feared what silence might say when the engine stopped. Silence spoke in April 1945. The radios carried news of German collapse as if a wire had snapped somewhere in the enemy's chest. Sorties turned to patrols, patrols to observation, observation to the peculiar quiet of flying with no one shooting back. Johnson wrote a final line in his small notebook aboard a transport home. "The loudest sound I ever heard is this one, with nothing in it." He closed the book and did not open it again for years. Stateside, the world tried to make him a hero he did not feel like. Parades asked him to wave. He waved and thought of ground crews who had never once waved from a podium. He sat for interviews and shortened stories to keep them from sounding like boasting. He said the airplane saved him and meant it. The reporters wrote it down and printed it because it made sense and because it was true. He visited schools and answered questions about fear. He said it came every time, and that the trick was not to pretend it didn't, but to treat it like weather. Adjust, correct, keep flying. He let children touch the dented armor plate a museum had mounted on a stand, and watch their faces move from delight to a dawning that this metal had once been between a man and an ending. He wished someone had told him when he was their age how much of adult life would be a matter of holding course with noisy instruments and incomplete maps. He learned to live with nights that brought the smell of hot oil uninvited. His wife knew by then to open a window and say nothing for a while. He would sit at the kitchen table and sip water until the table returned to being a table and not a wing that needed trimming. He did not call it trauma because the word had not entered his vocabulary. He called it remembering with the volume stuck too high. When he finally returned to Europe for commemorations, he found airfields tidier than they had ever been, runways neat, grass obedient. The ghosts behaved, mostly. But the air above certain places still felt different. Rouen sky had a gravity that could not be measured by instruments. Standing beneath a modern jet's roar, he could still separate in his mind the bass note of a radial from the polite, superior hiss of a turbine. The radial's sound went through bone. The turbine stayed in the ear. He preferred the bone truth of the old sound. The joke hid truth. The closer they flew to ground, the more the war turned personal. Men shooting at men with rifles, faces visible for seconds at a time. Johnson preferred altitude where the work was more like physics and less like homicide. But he did it all. Bridges, barges, armored cars idling under trees that pretended badly to be shadows. He learned how the Jug's heavy wing wanted a firm hand on the ailerons during a skip bomb, how the blast bounced the tail just enough to require a little opposite rudder or you'd cartwheel into your own shockwave. Through it all, the memory of June 26th was not a talisman so much as a weight. It reminded him that survival could be an accident. It made him careful with luck. When someone called him fearless, he disagreed. Fear was the brake that kept skill from racing off the road. He taught younger pilots to find the line. If your mouth is dry and your hands aren't, you're where you need to be. Spring carried better fuel tanks and longer missions. It also carried the name of a city that pilots said the way climbers say summit, Berlin. The day he first saw its distant smudge on the horizon, Johnson thought of maps he had seen as a boy in Oklahoma, the kind printed on schoolroom walls with colors that lied about distances. The real distance was hours of oxygen ache and the steady effort of staying ahead of fatigue's small mistakes. The Luftwaffe still came, but less like a hammer blow and more like a handful of nails thrown in your path, each one able to ruin your day, fewer of them every week. On a mission that April, the nails found him. A pair of 109s slipped in through a seam between flights and came for the bombers. Johnson rolled to meet them, picked the second in line and squeezed a burst that sawed the spinner off his target like a bottle cap. The first German broke away, then reversed hard and landed shots across Johnson's right wing. The Thunderbolt shuddered, the outboard gun went silent, but the airplane stayed honest. He dragged the fight downward and let the Jug's weight turn gravity into an ally. The 109 tried to follow and overcooked his dive. When both pulled out, the German had burned most of his energy. Johnson converted his remaining altitude into a climbing turn that put the 109 inside his ring sight. The second burst ended it. He flew home with a wing that looked chewed by a methodical dog and wrote a note in the mess, "The Jug forgives mistakes. The 109 does not." News arrived about Egon Meyer's death and passed through the wolf pack without gloating. Professionals did not cheer a dead professional. Johnson felt something like relief mixed with grief for a man he had never met except as a silhouette framed by gunsmoke. He told a crew chief, "If there's a ledger God keeps on pilots, he just balanced a hell of a page." The chief nodded and tightened a cowl fastener until it clicked. June brought invasion. On the morning of the 6th, the Channel looked like a city built out of ships. Johnson flew cover for paratroop routes first, then dragged his flight across beachheads where the air tasted of brine and burned cordite. German fighters came in knives drawn and sometimes got through. The Thunderbolt's job was to make them pay in metal for every mile they dared. Johnson watched a 190 dive toward a cluster of landing craft and arrived behind him in time to saw the tail off. The wreck hit the surf and vanished in steam. He looked down at the beach and saw men the size of pins moving between dunes and thought, "They're counting on us to make the sky boring." He began writing more. Short notes after missions that were never meant to be literature, just impressions a future self might need. He described how a P-47's dive felt like compression of the entire sky pressing into a tunnel, how the gun barrels warmed and then scorched the smell of cordite into the slipstream, how the first burst of return fire always sounded louder than physics allowed. He wrote about the ground crews too. Boys who never met the enemy but fought him with torque wrenches, safety wire, and an eye for cracks where cracks should not be. "If courage had fingerprints," he wrote once, "they'd be black with engine grease." When autumn came, headquarters started talking about range, how to get escort fighters deep enough to matter. The Republic engineers delivered hard answers: paddle blade propellers, better intercoolers, pylons under the wings for 75-gallon, then 108-gallon drop tanks. The Thunderbolt's brief was changing. It would still be the hammer at medium altitude, but now it would also be a shepherd, staying with bombers until the last prearranged minute. Johnson absorbed the new normal with a shrug. More fuel meant more sky. More sky meant more time for a mistake, his or the enemy's. On a clear morning in November, the mistake belonged to the enemy. Intercepted orders meant German fighters would mass near Emden, and the Wolf Pack climbed into a cold as clean as glass. At 28,000 feet, Johnson saw sunlight bite the edges of contrails until they looked like drawn swords. The first Focke-Wulfs arrived in ordered pairs, textbook attack angles that made instructors proud and veterans wary. Johnson pushed over and met the second pair with a deflection shot that came from practice as much as instinct. He saw flashes under the 190's cowl, oil, fire, a brief flurry of parts, and then a parachute. The other 190 rolled inverted and vanished into a dive too steep to follow. Johnson did not follow. The Jug's dive was a weapon. Misuse turned it into a grave. He counted his ammunition and slid back into position near the bombers. The B-17s marched on at their implacable pace, square, stubborn, windows full of faces that tried not to look at fighters dying to keep them safe. Sometimes the bomber boys waved, sometimes they just stared. Everyone understood the contract without discussing it. The fighters took the edges off death long enough for the heavies to finish the job. By Christmas, the war had replaced superstition with ritual. Johnson wore the same gloves whenever weather threatened ice. He always touched the armor plate behind his head before takeoff. He talked less. The ground crews talked more because talking kept worry from curdling. They named airplanes, a small human magic against a sky that did not know names. When the new year turned, the 8th Air Force planned bigger and risked more. The phrase "big week" traveled the rumor mill. Late February 1944, when everything with a wing would fly at once. The goal was simple and brutal: break the German fighter force faster than it could be repaired. The plan meant escorts would have to loiter over target areas crawling with flak and fighters. Johnson checked his flight's oxygen fittings 3 times on the morning the plan began. He had seen too many good men turn stupid at altitude because of a cracked hose. The first day felt like a season crammed into hours, takeoffs unspooling in lines until the horizon looked like a parade of silver. Johnson watched the bomber boxes form, 12 ships per squadron, then dozens of squadrons, sun flashing across wings like a Morse code too bright to decipher. The Luftwaffe came in angry waves, smart, fast, and doomed by arithmetic. The Wolfpack lost 2 pilots, the enemy lost more. Johnson landed with holes where holes did not belong, counted the holes, and went to the briefing for tomorrow's holes. By the end of Big Week, he had added 2 more victories to the small painted marks under his canopy rail. He did not remember firing the exact bursts that made them. He remembered a smell, a sound, a sudden quiet. In March, he learned to love low cloud. The enemy preferred ambush from above. Low overcast took away some of their geometry. Flying under it felt like a private room made of weather, dangerous in its own way, but honest. On one of those undercasts, he and his wingman drifted across a railroad yard just as a locomotive barged out from a line of sheds. The jug became something like a carpenter's tool in his hands. Set the angle, measure the run, let the 8 guns stitch. The boiler let go with a white scream, wagons jumped the rails, and the yard cut itself into a tangle the German quartermaster would curse for a month. Ground fire reminded them this was not a private job. They climbed back into the cloud and counted the peppering on the leading edges later. 2 more patches, the crew chief said, and somehow turned the number into a joke. The rivalry between men who never met became a parable for both sides of the air war. Courage, professionalism, and mutual respect existed even in the midst of slaughter. That theme would echo through the post-war years when veterans met at reunions and air shows. They compared memories, not grudges. Back in 1943, though, the war still hung in the balance. The 56th Group's successes made them celebrities in the U.S. Army Air Forces. Correspondents visited the base to photograph Johnson beside his new aircraft, its nose art reading Lucky in looping script. He disliked the attention, preferring to spend evenings in the operations hut writing letters home or talking mechanics through maintenance routines. He knew that a pilot's life depended on those sleepless men with oil-stained hands. He also knew that the Thunderbolt's strengths, its armor, its weight, were the direct reason he was still alive. Engineers at Republic Aviation later analyzed the remains of his original aircraft to improve later designs. They thickened control cable sheaths, strengthened hydraulic lines, and redesigned canopy locks to prevent jamming under stress. The lessons written in bullet holes would protect hundreds of pilots who never knew his name. By the spring of 1944, the balance of air power had shifted decisively. Long-range Mustangs began arriving to escort bombers all the way to Berlin, but the Thunderbolts continued to dominate medium altitudes and ground attack roles. Johnson and his comrades took pride in calling themselves mud movers. They strafed trains, trucks, and troop convoys from Normandy to the Ardennes. During one mission in April, Johnson's flight discovered a column of German vehicles retreating from the front. He dove steeply, releasing 2 500-pound bombs that turned the road into a storm of debris. Then he swung around and made 3 strafing passes, his guns walking fire across the length of the convoy. When he pulled up, the entire valley was burning. Over the radio came laughter mixed with disbelief. Someone said, "You sure you left anything for the infantry?" Even success carried a cost. Pilots rotated home after 200 combat hours, but many never reached that threshold. Johnson lost friends almost weekly, men whose bunks stayed neatly made, whose mail waited unclaimed. Each empty bed reminded the survivors that skill was never enough. As D-Day approached, the Wolf Pack shifted south to Boxted to cover the invasion. They flew from dawn until dusk, intercepting German fighters and striking rail lines feeding the beaches. On June 6, 1944, Johnson led a section over Normandy. Below them, the sea was black with ships. He saw flashes from naval guns, smoke rolling inland. Over the radio came the coded words that meant the invasion was underway. He remembered thinking that every bullet he had fired over the past year had been leading to this moment. When the war finally ended in Europe the following spring, Johnson had accumulated more than 1,000 combat hours. He returned to the United States in June 1945, a major, leaner, quieter, carrying a stack of medals he seldom wore. For him the glory was tempered by memory, the faces of those who hadn't made it, the sound of cannon shells hammering steel. He left active service later that year and published his memoir, Thunderbolt, written with journalist Martin Kadin. The book captured the humor and horror of a fighter pilot's life without sentimentality. It became one of the classic first-hand accounts of aerial combat in the Second World War. In its pages he described that June day over Rouen in plain language. "I was scared. Anyone who says he wasn't is lying. But the airplane saved me. It was as if it had a soul of its own." In post-war years, Johnson joined the Air National Guard and later worked in the aviation industry. He attended reunions of the 56th Fighter Group, where the veterans gathered under banners of faded squadron emblems. They told the same stories, each time a little slower, each time with more laughter. The myth of the invincible Jug became legend, and Johnson was its living proof. He tapped the armor plate behind the seat. "That piece of steel saved my hide. That, and luck. Mostly luck." In the weeks after the Rouen mission, Robert Johnson found it difficult to believe he was still alive. He would wake in his barracks at Halesworth with the smell of burned oil still lingering in his mind, the ghost of the vibration through the control stick still running up his arm. His uniform collar rubbed against the scar on his cheek. Every time the engines of another squadron spooled up outside, his pulse raced. The base psychologist told him to rest. Johnson went back to flying instead. Hubert Zemke, his commanding officer, understood the impulse. Zemke was part warrior, part scientist. He believed the only way to conquer fear was to stay in the air. So he took Johnson up on the next mission himself, flying alongside to rebuild his confidence. "You're not done yet, Bob," he told him through the intercom. "You owe that airplane a few German fighters." It was true. Johnson's near death had turned him into a symbol within the 56th Fighter Group. Ground crews began painting small thunderbolts on the sides of their aircraft for good luck. They called him the man who flew a sieve. Even the British pilots from neighbouring RAF units came to see the wreckage that had been his P-47C. Some touched the holes in its wings like pilgrims at a shrine. The Republic factory back in Farmingdale, New York, received photographs and used them in training posters. The armor plate, the punctured fuselage, the unbroken propeller blades. The caption read simply, "She brought him home." But Johnson's story wasn't finished. Over the next 9 months, he would fly more than 80 additional combat missions, each one deeper into Germany, each one more dangerous. By the summer of 1944, he had become one of America's top aces, credited officially with 27 aerial victories and at least half a dozen more probable kills. Those numbers told part of the story. The rest was how he fought. Johnson was no reckless duelist. He learned from Zemke to think like a hunter, strike once, fast, and leave. The P-47 was heavy, but in a dive it was unmatched. Johnson used that to perfection, swooping down from altitude on German formations, firing short bursts from his 8 machine guns, then diving away before they could react. The roar of his guns was like tearing canvas amplified through thunder. When the tracers hit, whole engines exploded from the impact of 50 caliber rounds. The men of the 56th became a fraternity of professionals. They woke before dawn to briefings that smelled of coffee and cigarette smoke, memorized weather reports, enemy bases and radio frequencies. In winter, their breath froze on oxygen masks. In summer, sweat pooled under flight suits. They measured life in missions and luck. Johnson often said, "If you make it past 50 missions, you start believing the airplane's on your side." In December 1943, the Wolfpack shifted from defensive escort to offensive sweeps across the Reich. Their targets were airfields, locomotives, and fuel depots, anything that could cripple German logistics. The Luftwaffe, once supreme, was bleeding pilots faster than it could train replacements. Yet every mission was still deadly. One cold morning near Oldenburg, Johnson's wingman was hit by flak. The P-47 rolled inverted and plunged toward the ground. Johnson dove after him, calling on the radio for a bailout. The wingman's canopy popped open, and a white parachute blossomed just before impact. When Johnson climbed back toward altitude, 2 Messerschmitts pounced from the sun. He rolled hard, firing a deflection burst that caught one squarely in the engine. The German fighter burst into flame and spiraled into a field. It was victory number 14. By now he was flying the improved P-47 D5, fitted with a bubble canopy for better visibility and wing pylons for extra fuel tanks. Each new model stretched the Thunderbolt's range farther into Germany. As 1944 began, bomber streams were pushing toward Leipzig, Frankfurt, even Berlin. The escorts had to follow, or the losses would be catastrophic. Johnson and his group often reached the limit of their endurance, landing with barely enough fuel to taxi off the runway. Throughout that winter, he thought often of the German who had spared him. Egon Mayer's name surfaced in intelligence briefings. Johnson recognized the tactics described, diving frontal attacks on bomber boxes. On February 2, 1944, Mayer was shot down and killed near Montmedy by P-47s of the 354th Group. When Johnson heard the news, he said nothing for a long time. Then quietly, "He was one hell of a pilot. Halfway across the channel, the gauges went dead. Electrical failure." He estimated position by the compass that still worked and the feel of the wind. The engine sputtered, caught again. Finally, green coastline appeared through haze. England. The miracle held. He lined up for Halesworth Field, gear half down, flaps jammed. The landing was brutal. Tires burst, the aircraft skidded across the grass, throwing mud. When it stopped, Johnson sat motionless, fists still clamped on the stick. Ground crews rushed forward expecting a corpse. Instead, the canopy creaked open, barely, and Johnson climbed out, covered in soot and blood. He grinned weakly and said, "You can't kill a jug." Mechanics surrounded the aircraft in disbelief. They counted more than 200 bullet holes and 21 cannon hits. The tail was shredded, control surfaces barely attached. Armor plate behind the seat showed deep gouges where 20mm rounds had stopped inches from the pilot's spine. One shell had penetrated the radio compartment but failed to explode. Another had ricocheted inside the fuselage and lodged harmlessly behind a hydraulic line. Colonel Zemke himself examined the wreck. "Don't patch it," he told the maintenance officer. "Leave it as is. Let every pilot see what this airplane can take." The battered P-47 became an informal monument on the airfield until parts were eventually salvaged for training. Medical officers treated Johnson for shrapnel cuts and minor burns. He had lost blood but no major function. Within days he was back in the air, flying a new Thunderbolt he christened Lucky. The nickname was an understatement. Reports of the incident spread quickly through 8th Air Force channels. Newspapers back home ran headlines, "Oklahoma pilot survives 200 hits over France." Fellow pilots treated him like a talisman. Johnson shrugged off the attention, insisting the real hero was the airplane. In a letter to his parents, he wrote, "The jug is the best friend a man ever had." Colonel Zemke nominated him for the Distinguished Service Cross, the Army's second highest decoration for valor. The citation credited his extraordinary heroism and coolness under fire. General Ira Eaker personally endorsed the award, noting that the engagement demonstrated the exceptional ruggedness of the P-47 and the indomitable spirit of its pilots. Back in Germany, Luftwaffe records noted a single heavily damaged American fighter escaping after prolonged attack near Rouen. The pilot identities were never confirmed, but years later historians matched times and locations. It was indeed Major Egon Mayer's squadron that engaged Johnson that day. Mayer himself was killed in combat in February 1944. Johnson lived until 1998, often telling his story at reunions with a wry smile. "He was a gentleman, that German. He could have killed me. Maybe he chose not to." The battle over Rouen was not just a personal miracle, it was a turning point in perception. Up to that summer, many bomber crews doubted the value of fighter escort. The Thunderbolt was considered clumsy and fuel-hungry compared with the nimble Spitfires of the RAF. Johnson's survival changed minds overnight. It proved that American engineering had produced a machine unmatched for durability. Pilots began to push the aircraft harder, diving faster, carrying heavier bomb loads. In the months that followed, Thunderbolts destroyed rail lines, convoys, and Luftwaffe airfields across occupied Europe. By 1944, with drop tanks extending range, they escorted bombers all the way to Berlin. The plane once mocked as the Jug became the backbone of Allied air superiority. Johnson himself went on to become the first US AAF pilot in the European theatre to surpass 26 aerial victories, matching Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record. Each new kill was painted as a small swastika under the canopy of his aircraft. 50 caliber justice delivered by the same hands that once held a dead stick over France. Years later, standing beside a restored Thunderbolt at an air show, Johnson was asked what he thought about during those endless minutes being shot to pieces. He paused. "Nothing," he said softly. "You don't think. You just fly. You trust the airplane, and you hope the good Lord likes Pratt and Whitney engines." Miraculously, the Thunderbolt kept flying. The R-2800 radial, built by Pratt and Whitney to absorb punishment, coughed black smoke but held together. The German pilot must have been astonished. He circled for another pass. Johnson later recalled, "I could see him laughing in the cockpit." This dance continued for nearly 10 minutes. The Focke-Wulf attacked from every angle, high, low, broadside, emptying belts of 20mm shells into the lumbering jug. Holes the size of fists appeared in the wings. The canopy was spider-webbed with cracks. Fuel leaked from punctured tanks, yet still she flew. Johnson tried to bail out, but the jammed canopy refused to budge. He hammered at it with a flare pistol. The pistol broke. He was trapped. The absurdity hit him. If the plane caught fire, he'd burn alive inside the very armor meant to save him. But the fire never came. The self-sealing tanks held. The engine temperature stayed barely within the red line. Below, the French countryside slid past. Patchwork fields, thin roads, villages curling around church steeples. Johnson trimmed the aircraft to fly hands-off, conserve in strength. He was bleeding from cuts to the face and arm, but adrenaline dulled the pain. Each minute alive felt like borrowed time. Then came more dots on the horizon. Dozens of German fighters, probably from Jagdgeschwader II Richthofen, scrambled to intercept the bombers. The lone smoking Thunderbolt drew their attention like a flare. One peeled off to inspect, then another. Within moments, Johnson faced what he later estimated as 40 enemy aircraft swirling above him. The leader of the German formation, historians believe, was Major Egon Meyer, an ace already credited with more than 60 victories. Meyer had pioneered head-on attacks against US bombers and was considered one of the Luftwaffe's most skilled tacticians. Spotting the crippled American fighter, he likely intended a quick kill, an easy mark on the return leg. But as the 190s formed a queue to fire, something remarkable unfolded. Each made a pass, raked the P-47 with cannon fire, and pulled up expecting it to fall. Each time it kept flying. Johnson later said, "It was like being inside a drum. Every hit sounded like God striking a hammer on the hull. Holes appeared in the wings large enough to crawl through. Control cables hung like shredded vines. The tail was frayed. Yet the aircraft maintained forward momentum, steady as a wounded whale." After the 6th attack, Meyer himself moved in for the coup de grace. He eased his 190 alongside, studying the battered jug. Johnson could see the German's face, pale beneath goggles. The ace raised a gloved hand as if in salute, then rolled right and fired one last burst at point-blank range. The shells smashed into the engine, cowling and ricocheted away. Then Meyer broke off and climbed. Whether he was out of ammunition or mercy, no one knows. The German formation banked north, leaving the smoking American to his fate. Johnson exhaled for the first time in 20 minutes. He had no radio, no navigation instruments, half blind from oil spray, but he was alive. He turned the crippled plane toward the channel. He dropped altitude to avoid flak, skimming treetops at barely 300 feet. The wind howled through bullet holes, whistling like an organ. French farmers looked up as the battered fighter roared overhead, trailing smoke. Johnson glimpsed cows scattering and fields streaked with fire where spent tracer rounds ignited grass. At Dieppe, he crossed the coast. Below, German gun emplacements opened up, but the erratic flight path confused their aim. The P-47 staggered onward over grey water. Oil coated the windshield completely. Johnson had to slide his head sideways to see through a crack. He kept one hand on the throttle, one on the trim wheel, whispering a prayer with every engine cough. June 26th, 1943. The summer sun had barely risen over eastern England when the engines of the 56th Fighter Group began to thunder across the airfield at Halesworth. The roar of 18-cylinder Pratt and Whitney R-2800s shook the hangars and rippled the grass. Men in khaki coveralls ran along the taxiway, guiding the massive fighters into formation. The smell of high-octane fuel and scorched oil mixed with the damp scent of morning fog. Another day, another mission into enemy airspace, another gamble that some would not return. Among the pilots climbing into cockpits that morning was Lieutenant Robert Samuel Johnson, 24 years old, compact, dark-haired, a soft Oklahoma accent buried beneath the clipped radio diction of a combat pilot. He belonged to the 61st Fighter Squadron, one of 3 units that made up Colonel Hubert Zemke's famous Wolf Pack. Johnson's aircraft, a Republic P-47 C-2RE Thunderbolt, serial 416235, was a gleaming chunk of aluminum and steel almost as large as a medium bomber's fuselage. 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns lined its wings like the teeth of some prehistoric predator. Behind them sat Johnson in a seat of armor plate 2 inches thick. Around him, 2,000 horsepower of roaring machinery. That day's assignment seemed straightforward. The 8th Air Force was sending heavy bombers against German rail yards near Rouen in northern France. The 56th Group's job, escort the B-17s as far as their limited fuel allowed, then turn back toward England. The Americans called these flights rodeo escorts. They were anything but leisurely. The Luftwaffe had learned the bomber routes and was striking with swarms of Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf FW 190s almost daily. For a young lieutenant, it meant long hours of tension at altitude followed by minutes of chaos and terror. Ground crews yanked away the wheel chocks. Johnson pushed the throttle forward and felt the jug surge ahead. The propeller blades blurred into a silver disc, the big radial engine hammering like a blacksmith's forge. One by one, the Thunderbolts lifted off, climbing steeply into a pale sky streaked with contrails from departing bomber formations. Johnson tucked into position on his element leader's right wing, keeping exact station as they crossed the Norfolk coastline and out over the Channel. At 20,000 feet, the sky was dazzling. The world below turned miniature, the Channel a strip of pewter, France a hazy grey mass. Radio chatter was sparse, only course headings and fuel checks. The P-47's cockpit was noisy and hot, the canopy magnifying the sun's glare. Johnson glanced at the gauges. Oil pressure good, turbocharger humming. He relaxed slightly, unaware that within an hour he'd be fighting for his life. The first warning came as black puffs below the bombers, flak from German 88mm guns ringing Rouen. The Wolfpack's job was to keep the Luftwaffe busy while the bombers dropped their loads. Johnson watched the lead flight peel off to investigate a cluster of 109s diving from the sun. He followed, throttle wide open, but almost instantly the world exploded around him. Cannon shells slammed into his right wing, One detonated near the cockpit. The blast shredded control cables and showered him with plexiglass shards. He ducked instinctively, feeling a line of searing pain along his nose and right cheek. Shrapnel. His canopy jammed halfway open, the lock-in mechanism twisted. Smoke poured from the engine compartment, filling the cockpit with the bitter stench of burning oil. He rolled the Thunderbolt into a dive to escape, but another burst struck behind the armor plate. The aircraft shuddered violently. His 8 machine guns refused to fire, jammed solid, their feed belts torn. Alone, crippled and unarmed, Johnson leveled out at 8,000 feet heading west, praying the big engine would hold. For several minutes he flew blind through smoke, half-choked, ears ringing. When he cleared his eyes, the sky seemed empty. He was deep over occupied France, perhaps 30 miles from the Channel. If he could keep altitude, maybe he could glide to friendly territory. Then the canopy shadow darkened, another aircraft sliding into position above and behind. A sleek, dark grey fighter with black crosses on its wings, a Focke-Wulf 190. The German came in fast. Johnson yanked the stick, but half his ailerons were gone. Cannon shells ripped across the fuselage. Sparks flew inside the cockpit. He felt something punch into his left shoulder, but could still move his arm. The 190 zoomed past, curved around, and came again. Tracers streamed past his face like red beads. One struck the gun sight glass, shattering it into glittering fragments. The noise was deafening. Johnson pressed himself behind the armor seat, hands locked on the useless controls.